Great. I think we have quite a few attendees in the room now, so I can kick things off if all the panelists are ready. Great. So welcome everyone to our session, Green Energy, Red Flags, Climate Change, Modern Slavery, and Renewable Energy Compliance Gap, which is part of this year's Climate Week. So first of all, just to extend a huge welcome to everybody joining today. We're so glad to have you here. I'm going to kick things off with a quick introduction before we head over to the panelists to make their opening remarks. We will be having a Q&A session after that. So I really warmly invite you to submit your questions. And if you would like to address your question to a particular panelist, please do indicate that as well. So first of all, to kick us off, I want to provide some framing for the session on the intersection between climate change and modern slavery, as well as a bit of a definition of modern slavery itself. So what is modern slavery? So modern slavery covers a set of specific legal concepts, which include forced labor, debt bondage, forced marriage, slavery, and human trafficking. It refers to situations of exploitation that a person cannot refuse or leave because of threats, violence, coercion, deception, and/or the abuse of power. And we know that modern slavery is extremely prevalent across industry and country contexts. So based on Walk Free's latest global estimates, 50 million people are living in situations of modern slavery on any given day. And that means that they're either forced to work against their will or in a marriage that they were forced into. And this number translates to nearly 1 in every 150 people in the world. Think about that, 1 in every 150 people. And that means that modern slavery touches every industry and every country. Each day, people are being tricked, coerced, or forced into exploitative situations that they cannot refuse or leave. And that also means that every day we are buying products, using services they have been forced to make or offer. And that's without ourselves realizing that hidden human cost. We see that modern slavery is implicated in those industries which are closely linked to environmental and climate-related degradation. For example, those industries involved in deforestation. But it also touches industries that are most necessary for our urgent transition to clean energy. Those industries are also sadly reliant on exploitation and forced labor. And our panelists will be expanding on this in their opening remarks as well. In my own work as program director at the open data platform wikirate.org, our team helps organizations to conduct research and open up data sets on corporate policies and actions to address both environmental and human rights issues. And we really see how those issues do intersect. To give an example, as we transition, as the demand for transition minerals in the renewable sector continues to increase, we must have a clear message that action on climate must go hand in hand with human rights in order to achieve a just transition to clean energy. And to achieve this, we also need greater transparency from companies if we are able to hold them accountable for addressing these issues. And today, I'm just so pleased we have such an excellent lineup of panelists who will be talking about their work on modern slavery and how forced labor cross-cuts climate-linked industries. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Abigail Monroe. Abby is a research and advocacy analyst at Walk Free, an international human rights group working to accelerate the end of all forms of modern slavery. Walk Free is the creator of the Global Slavery Index, the world's most comprehensive data set on modern slavery. And Abby is a research lead for the Europe and Asia and Central Asia region and works on projects at the intersection of business and human rights. I will get sharing your slides, Abby, but just for now, over to you.
Thank you, Aileen, and thank you everyone for joining today. So my presentation will be focused on the Beyond Compliance project, which is a research partnership between Walk3 and WikiRate. And the project assesses how companies across a variety of sectors are responding to legislation requiring them to report on addressing the risks of modern slavery in their direct operations and supply chains. So we've been running this project for about 8 years now and looking at a different sector each year. And the latest report in this series, which we're launching today, focuses on the renewable energy sector. If we could go to the next slide, please. So why the renewable energy sector? The demand for renewable energy is booming, and for good reason. In line with a global move towards a just transition to green energy, the market was valued at almost $900 billion in 2021 and is expected to reach 1.9 trillion by 2030. And it currently employs almost 13 million people globally. While there's no doubt that this transition is essential to the future of our planet, for it to be truly just, it must uphold the human rights of those involved. And evidence is already showing that there are a number of red flags in pursuit of green energy. So, for example, workers in the industry are vulnerable to forced labour, wage theft, hazardous conditions, and illegal overtime, among other factors. Some parts of the world with the highest potential in terms of renewable energy sources are also home to large numbers of migrant workers who are more vulnerable to exploitation. Operations to extract minerals and resources for renewable energy production are linked to egregious human rights violations in many parts of the world. And this includes state-imposed forced labour in China's Uyghur region, which my fellow panellist Louisa will be discussing in more detail, and also mining in conflict-affected areas in the DRC and child labour. And finally, the industry has complex and fragmented supply chains that often operate in locations where laws protecting human rights either don't exist, are weak, or are not enforced by local authorities. So all of these factors together translate to companies in the industry having a heightened responsibility to prevent modern slavery and protect workers within their supply chains. If we can go to the next slide, please. So our research findings is that companies are not responding to this responsibility. So we assessed the statements produced between 2020 and 2022 under the UK and Australian Modern Slavery Acts by 60 of the largest and most influential energy companies. And that included those working with only renewable energy sources and also traditional energy companies that have a renewable energy output. We assessed these against a core set of metrics developed based on the two sets of legislation and their guidelines, as well as metrics based on modern slavery risks that are specific to the sector. So covering issues that I mentioned on the previous slide. And we identified these 5 major gaps, which I'll run through now and select some of the key findings under each of those. If we go to the next slide, please, Aileen. So our first finding was that energy companies are failing to effectively meet their reporting obligations under modern slavery legislation. So only 37% of the total companies met the minimum requirements for the legislation that they were reporting under, and that's 32% under the Australian Act and 39% of those under the UK Act. So what this means is the vast majority of companies are falling at the first hurdle. They're submitting statements that don't comply to the legislation. And what makes this all the more disappointing is that the minimum requirements are relatively basic, and the legislations have been in place for years now, so companies should be familiar with what's required. For the UK legislation in particular, the content of the statement isn't prescribed. So while it would show blatant disregard, companies could remain compliant by releasing a statement that reports they've done nothing to investigate their supply chains. And as long as they met those 3 publication requirements, they would be compliant. So while this speaks to companies not engaging at a minimum level with the legislation, it also speaks to the legislation itself not being strong enough, which we'll touch upon in the recommendations. Next slide, please, Aileen. So our second finding is that companies working with only renewable energy sources are falling behind. Companies within the assessment with a renewables only offering, which was 44% of the total companies assessed, performed worse than mixed energy companies across most metrics. This includes considerably lower disclosure rates related to mapping supply chains, identifying supply chain risks, and responding to sector-specific modern slavery risk. And this is a particularly shocking finding, given the transition to renewable energy has sustainability and fairness at its core. So while it might be that mixed energy companies are more established in the space, are held to greater scrutiny and bear a greater reputational risk, these findings do raise serious concerns that the emerging renewable energy companies are failing to protect people in pursuit of protecting the planet. If we could go to the next slide, please. Our third finding was ineffective disclosures by companies is rendering millions of workers invisible. So while 78% of companies disclosed having a modern slavery policy in place, the vast majority of those, 67%, did not apply them beyond their tier 1 direct suppliers. But we know that modern slavery risks only increase deeper into supply chains. A shocking 43% of companies disclose no information at all on their supply chains, with not a single company disclosing the names of their suppliers. So, as I mentioned, renewable energy supply chains are complex, often spanning geographical locations and are fragmented. So if the companies themselves are not mapping these, then millions of workers are rendered invisible to mechanisms designed to protect them. Next slide, please. Companies are not approaching due diligence or remediation with a worker-focused lens. So companies in the renewable energy sector are operating in a high-risk environment, and yet more than a quarter have no supply chain due diligence in place. And what we mean by that is that there's no risk management, such as conducting audits or site visits, and no remediation process, which seriously impedes their ability to detect or respond to exploitation. This makes it unsurprising that only 3 companies in the assessment disclosed any incident of modern slavery in their supply chains. And unfortunately, the fact is, if companies were conducting the level of due diligence that they should be, the vast majority, if not all of them, would find exploitation. If companies aren't adequately looking for modern slavery, then it follows that their policies for responding to incidents are lacking, which is what we found. So 5% of companies disclosed, only 5% of companies disclosed direct worker remediation policies. This is an approach which prioritizes solutions based on the rights and well-being of affected workers. But instead, the most common form of remediation was to cancel contracts. Simply cutting ties with a factory or supplier could increase the risk that workers are exposed to forced labor or other forms of exploitation. So ultimately, this suggests that many companies are approaching due diligence and worker remediation as a risk-cutting exercise for the company itself, perhaps to protect their own reputations rather than actually placing individual workers' well-being as central to the process. Next slide, please. So our final finding was that companies' attention to modern slavery risks is alarmingly inadequate. So more than half of companies failed to include any disclosures on sector-specific modern slavery risks, such as ensuring living wages throughout supply chains or conducting due diligence on sourcing minerals from conflict-affected areas. And although reporting on these risks isn't prescribed by the legislation itself, we'd hope that in the spirit of the law, companies would be actively engaging with these risks as they are well known within the sector. Another example here is, despite the grave human rights violations and evidence of state-imposed forced labor associated with solar panel production in the Uyghur region in China, only one company disclosed that they restrict sourcing components originating from this region. And as I mentioned, Louisa will be shedding some more light on the human impact of businesses turning a blind eye to this issue. Next slide, please. So on to our recommendations. modern slavery is only effective insofar as it's meaningfully engaged with by companies. And our assessment clearly reveals that too often companies in the renewable energy sector are failing to meet the true essence of both the Modern Slavery Acts and also the just transition at large. So we've detailed recommendations in our briefing, which I'll share a link to in this chat, and would really encourage you to explore both the findings and the recommendations in more detail. But just to summarize some of these, we need companies to improve their reporting standards under modern slavery legislation, improve supply chain transparency, conduct due diligence to address modern slavery risks that are specific to the sector, and engage with industry and non-industry initiatives to really drive standards. Next slide, please. At the same time, we've highlighted the inadequacy of legislation that has no consequence for substandard reporting. So we need governments to improve guidance and monitoring, review and enforcement of modern slavery legislation, to address weak compliance by issuing financial penalties, among other measures, and to conduct ongoing review of legislation to ensure that it reflects international standards and learnings. Ultimately, as Aileen mentioned, the systems we put in place to address the climate crisis must be equally as committed to protecting the human rights of those involved. And for a truly just and sustainable solution, the future must be powered responsibly. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Abby. I think really highlighting some key points there. And I think one thing that really jumped out at me is considering that high prevalence of modern slavery globally, as well as that kind of complexity of renewable energy supply chains that you mentioned. It's really confronting to see that over 40% of those companies are actually disclosing no information at all about their supply chains. And I think to make more concrete exactly how renewable energy is implicated in forced labor in those supply chains, I will be handing over to Louisa Grieve. Louisa is Director of Global Advocacy for the Uyghur Human Rights Project, where she works on accountability for atrocity crimes, transnational repression, and corporate accountability. She represents her organization on the steering committee of the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur region. Over to you, Louisa.
Thank you, Eileen. I'm going to share some slides as well, and I'd appreciate feedback on whether you can see it properly. Yes. Is that right? Okay, good. Thank you. So Uyghur region, the homeland of the Uyghur people, my organization has been documenting human rights abuses for 20 years. Never imagined that what we've recently learned about the connection of this, what you might say a remote area, far from any seaport, connection to a global industry. And unfortunately, clean energy is being sourced for many of the world's supplies on a very horrible situation. So I just want to show some of the intellectuals, relatives of Australian Uyghurs, European, Canadian, US, Turkish, who are disappeared, have died in custody, or are serving long prison sentences. So this is why we say it's atrocity crimes, where you have street level checkpoints, a high securitized state, deep monitoring and data collection on every person, designed to persecute people for their identity, and in fact remake them into someone else, with in-home surveillance, as well as the data collection and then mass roundups. And this all became known internationally in 2017, 2018. You did have New York Times reporting about centers called concentrated centers, education through training, and it was, a lot of it was very secret, so it was very valuable to have being able to dig, right? You couldn't blame some companies and consumers for not really knowing what was going on. It was necessary to use satellite data to show a building here that's actually just at the front of a vast complex where people are being held. Very serious, widespread mass roundup. And then, what is it for? Well, this woman is telling, when CNN was able to go in at a government determined place, I listened many times to illegal preachers. Afterwards, some extremist thoughts appeared in my head, which broke the law. So we're talking about thought crime. And then there's the vocational training here that is part of it, to even after they've been through so-called training, then put them to work. So I'm showing you a headline from 2019 to show this is not something known from the last 2 years. December 19 is actually pretty late from when the evidence came out. But when we look at specifically renewables, we're very indebted to Sheffield Hallam University's Helen Kennedy Center. So I'll try to bring you through a little bit of what's been documented here. I mean, what you're seeing here on the photo here is the very dirty work of processing the quartz. So the conclusions of this report were looking at the fact that 95% of solar modules rely on solar-grade polysilicon. At the time of this report in 2021, 45% of the world's supply came directly from the manufacturers in the Uyghur homeland. And these manufacturers, there's evidence, they found evidence that they are participating in the government's labor placement program that's part of the genocide. And we have to take into account, in addition to the 45%, another 30% of the world's polysilicon in 2021 was coming from China. And that may be affected by forced labor, either people who are forced into workplaces outside the homeland, or where there may be some sourcing from within the region. So at that time, 11 Chinese solar companies were engaged in labor transfers. They found another 4 in the industrial parks, and overall 90 companies whose supply chains were affected. So after that report, you do have this action in the US to simply create an enforcement mechanism so that the US import ban on forced and child labor goods can't come into the US. And this law creates a rebuttable presumption. Let me just give you a little update on where that is. Nearly $1.8 billion worth of goods. And by far the largest sector affected by the targeting is what's here called electronics at the top, if you can see that. And that's where solar panels are included. And in addition, you do have base metals, you have industrial and manufacturing materials, which also may affect renewables. So we have a recent update from August this year, Overexposed Uyghur Region Exposure Assessment for Solar Industry Sourcing. So this should go, for all the people who are taking to heart Walk Free's recommendations. This provides a framework, and other materials provide step-by-step ways to actually trace your own supply chain as a company. So the new number is that actually it's only 35% of the world's polysilicon at this point. So that's a good news story. It means that supply chains can be moved. It means that production can be picked up, and naturally, the hope would be that this is in jurisdictions that do enforce labor laws, have freedom of association, and have other protections for workers. But unfortunately, still the vast majority of modules have exposure to the Uyghur region. And unfortunately, many suppliers appear to have bifurcated their supply chains to create a product line that will comply with the US law. And unfortunately, these claims are hard to verify, because they do continue to source from suppliers or sub-suppliers that have exposure to the Uyghur region for other product lines. So the bottom line is, despite this significant global pressure, including Walk Free's work, information is actually becoming less transparent, the findings. Now, I want to add in beyond solar. This report from December last year also touches on EV. So I'll just share one graphic that actually was just shared in the Washington Post 3 days ago on September 18th on China being a huge source for both conventional and electric vehicle supply chains, again, from a very remote region in terms of shipping. So we were looking at aluminum, graphite, steel, zinc, and lithium. So I'll just quote the co-author, Kendall Salcido. We knew there was forced labor built into the whole program, but we didn't know it would touch on so many commodities and parts. We hadn't actually understood how horrific the spread of forced labor was in this sector. So I want to emphasize this is a case of state-imposed forced labor. So, what Abby was saying about the need to have a worker-focused lens, not to simply drop suppliers when the point should be to protect the rights of the workers. In the case of the Xinjiang government and the Uyghurs, for multiple reasons, access is denied. There is no ability to have reliable audits. So rather than being able to, in some way, affect worker conditions, it's impossible. It's the state that's doing it. And the policy is that forced labor shall apply to all working adults. That's policy. And this was reinforced just less than a month ago. Xi Jinping, party leader, came and delivered a speech emphasizing the need to improve and strengthen current policies to produce, quote, stability in the Uyghur region. So bottom line, we have 17 plus global industries. It's not just the renewables, but as Abby says, the renewables really ought to be who are looking for ethical, doing the right thing for the planet and for people. We do have to put the Uyghur situation front and center. And this is why, given the all-encompassing controls, in fact, the call is by my group, by the entire 400 plus groups in our coalition to end forced labor in the Uyghur region, that really exit is the option to comply with ethical obligations. Thanks.
Thank you, Louisa. And I think some really striking examples there of those links that we've been talking about. And I think that statistic around that still 35% of the world's polysilicon, which is a major component in solar panels, is being produced in the Uyghur region, just showing that kind of interlinkage between state forced labor and the renewable energy industry worldwide. And linking to those examples from Louisa, I will now hand over to Chloe Cranston, who will be talking about the policy responses to address Uyghur and other forms of forced labor in the renewable energy sector. Chloe is head of thematic advocacy programs at Anti-Slavery International, overseeing the organization's campaigns on responsible business, climate change and modern slavery, safe migration, and state-imposed forced labor. She is also a steering committee member of the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur region. Over to you, Chloe.
Great, thank you, Eileen, and thank you to all of you for having me on this panel with you, and everybody for joining. So in terms of this bigger picture topic, so one of Anti-Slavery International's strategic focus areas is this intersection of modern slavery and climate change, and we work on this in two ways. So first, a big part of our programming is looking at the intersection of climate change, modern slavery, and migration, where we're calling for policy responses to the heightened risk of modern slavery, forced labor, human trafficking, of people who have been forcibly displaced by climate change or facing immobility. We've looked at this in Ghana and Bangladesh, for example, and we're gathering global evidence on this problem. I'm not actually going to plan to speak on that now, given the, what's on the agenda of this panel, but I'm happy in the Q&A to speak to that part of our work. So what I will speak about now is the other area of our climate change work, which is the use of forced labor in the renewable energy sector. So Laura has set out the persecution in the Uyghur region and the crisis this poses for our urgent transition from fossil fuels and the renewable energy sector. At Anti-Slavery International, we've been working on this issue for a number of years alongside Louisa, and I'm sure many of attendees of these calls. And in particular, in the last 6 months or so, we've been conducting research on this area In coming months, we're going to be publishing a policy brief to governments and guidance to investors, together with the Investor Alliance for Human Rights and Sheffield Hallam University, specifically on this issue of Uyghur forced labour in the solar and electric vehicle battery industries. So based on all of our work to date, I will just share a big picture view of Anti-Slavery International's view of the current policy response and what needs to be done. I'm afraid I don't have any snazzy slides, so just me listing things. So first, what we've really come to see is that there's a very clear silo of the crisis of Uyghur forced labour in the renewable energy sector, first from other related discussions on renewables, and then generally from the overall climate change agenda. This seems to be due to a range of issues. So one, an overall lack of awareness. Two, frankly, heads in the sand about the scale of this crisis. And three, China's monopolization of the solar and increasingly EV market, as Louisa laid out, which has created a sense of fatalism on the solutions. In solar in particular, we have a false dichotomy being created that's either a Uyghur forced labor reliant solar industry or nothing. However, Laura has laid out the clear horrors of what is happening, and we owe it to our current and our future generations that our transition from fossil fuels, which is urgent and is necessary, is not built off the back of genocide, crimes against humanity, and persecution of entire populations. So overall, the ongoing reliance on the Uyghur region for the solar and EV industry poses clear conflicts to existing global commitments on this transition from fossil fuels. First, if we kind of put it into broader policy agendas, actually, which go away from Anti-Slavery International's remit, from an energy security perspective, recent lessons from Russia's invasion of Ukraine show the risk of relying on one single location or a limited number of suppliers for energy supply, regardless of the country. So governments are increasingly looking at China's dominance of these markets from an energy security perspective. Second, global leaders such as G7 leaders have made numerous commitments to enable a just transition, meaning that workers' rights and local communities' rights must be protected in the context of mining, refining, and processing for renewable energy sector. And three, any reliance on coal to achieve cost competitiveness in the solar industry, which is the current situation in the Uyghur region, and I can discuss that more in Q&A, is at odds with global climate goals. The IPCC reports solid evidence supporting the urgency of divesting from carbon to avoid climate impacts, stressing how it's far less expensive to avoid further emissions. So if the Uyghur region solar industry entirely reliant on coal, it's clear we need much more urgent work to develop truly clean, both in terms of carbon emissions and in terms of forced labor and other labor rights and human rights, solar supply chains. So what then needs to be done? I will lay out 5 key policy areas which we at Anti-Slavery International are digging into as to what can be done to address this crisis. First, we need to see it prioritized. It needs to be at the top of policy agendas nationally and internationally, such as spaces like this, Climate Week, the G7, the G20, COP28, and all other relevant debates. We need to see it incorporated into when other relevant discussions are being discussed, such as critical mineral strategies and any discussion on transition minerals. Second, if we think about how do we support these industries in this transition, we need governments to be introducing subsidies, financial incentives, mobilizing investment and research, which supports the growth of cost-effective alternative sources of supply so that our current markets are not reliant on state-imposed forced labor. This includes the integration of this issue into development agendas, including considering the use of development finance. So governments can support the opportunities to use development support and policy to support other countries around the world to develop as hubs for processing and manufacturing. But we also need this to avoid a problem shift. We don't want to see new markets created which also have egregious human rights abuses and high carbon emissions. So we need to see truly clean alternatives. We also need to use sticks, and this is some of what Abby referred to. We need to see requirements introduced in procurement standards and tenders which prohibit the use of forced labour products and incentivize a shift in sourcing. Similarly, the introduction of import bans or controls such as the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act, as referred to by Louisa, and human rights and environmental due diligence laws, which require companies and investors to end and address links with forced labour. And finally, in the ESG space, which again I can go more into, we need to de-silo the E and the S. So we have numerous ESG related regulations and green finance and investment related regulations, which have really incentivized, rightly, investment into renewables, but they have no human rights or social lens in them, or barely any, and that needs to be reformed and addressed. I'll leave it at there, but ultimately we need to end the fatalism about this topic, which is something that we've seen, and we need to really start having solutions-oriented discussions which bring together the human rights and climate movement to make sure we do have truly ethical renewable energy supply chains going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chloe. And I think really making it clear there, the different strategies that can be taken, but also this kind of dire need that we have to really highlight this issue when we're talking about the climate change agenda as well. So just another call for the participants to add some questions to the Q&A. There's a Q&A function in the Zoom, so please do enter your questions there. We already have some coming in, so I will start asking those to the panelists. There's one here from one attendee. Thank you everyone for your fantastic interventions. Focusing on the UK-Australian Modern Slavery Acts, what should these governments be doing to strengthen these laws to improve the poor rates of reporting? Now, I will put that one to Abby first of all, but if anybody else from the panel wants to chime in, please do so.
Thank you, Aileen. Yeah, great question, because our Beyond Compliance project shows in all the industries we've looked at consistently poor reporting standards. So it really is, it's not an issue specific to one industry. And a lot of that responsibility lies with the government issuing the legislation. So I touched upon some of the recommendations in my presentation there around issuing financial penalties, for example. And at Walk Free, we do direct advocacy with governments on improving Modern Slavery Act legislation, and also implementing new legislation where it doesn't currently exist. So we've worked with the Australian and UK government on their review processes on the Modern Slavery Act legislation, but we're yet to actually see any commitments made translate into action. So, for example, the UK government committed to a range of reforms to the Modern Slavery Act in 2020, and we're yet to see those actually take place. So that would be the first solution, would be to strengthen the acts. But ultimately, we advocate for mandatory human rights due diligence legislation, which Chloe just mentioned there. So this is a stronger, more proactive form of legislation, obligating companies the duty to prevent and protect, as well as to report. And there's a number of examples of this legislation around the world already, and most of them do include that financial penalty issue. So driving compliance. So really that we would see that as a gold standard form of legislation.
Great, thank you, Abby. And maybe just to pick up with you, Chloe, you were kind of mentioning that de-siloing of the E and S in ESG. So how does your organization feel that the climate change and human rights movements could work together better on this issue?
Yes, I think there's one thing about how does that look in regulation and the role of policymakers, but I would also give a call out to the NGO community and the academic community, and the whole community. I imagine, I'm not there in New York City, but there's a huge range of people there. And we really see, I've anecdotally heard there's been conferences, for example, on transition minerals, where the Uyghur forced labor issue hasn't been discussed at all. But what we do know is many of the minerals may be mined elsewhere, but they're increasingly imported by China and then processed in the Uyghur region. So that's the situation, for example, with EV, though there is also mining in the Uyghur region. And so connecting the dots between this industry and understanding the scale of the human rights abuses, where we're talking about state-imposed forced labor and also indigenous people's rights, connecting the dots about all the different human rights harm and environmental harm that's happening in that industry, and building solidarity between all of us who are working on those issues. And it would be great to see, you know, events like Climate Week that's being higher on the agenda and so on as well.
Great, thank you, Chloe. And actually quite related to that, and this is a question from the audience for Chloe and Louisa. What has been the reaction of businesses and investors when you highlight that interconnected nature of climate change and forced labor occurring in the Uyghur region? Are there any good examples of businesses and investors engaging on this issue?
I'll have to say, watch this space a little bit, because this is exactly what we're going to be publishing some work on soon. So in coming months, we're going to publish our guidance to investors, which will include our findings about where investors currently are. But in terms of an early preview, I can say it does vastly range. There are some investors which have, you know, very high awareness of this problem, particularly in solar, somewhat less in EV. But I would say the big challenge we do have is understanding the egregious nature of the harm in the Uyghur region. And so Abby very rightly earlier referred to the fact that if a company identifies forced labor in its supply chain, it shouldn't just cut and run from that supplier. That's what should happen in most forced labor cases, where it's so-called privately imposed forced labor. But in state-imposed forced labor, where there's nothing that can be done on the ground, and you have the Uyghur community. So Louisa showed that photo of, I think, about 40 people who have gone missing, disappeared, and so on. Their family members, their friends are calling for this divestment and this disengagement from the industry, from the Uyghur region. But unfortunately, investors and companies are not quite there yet. They don't understand the urgent necessity of divestment. We have seen some examples, but not nearly enough. And so we also really need the industry to come together and really have a coordinated response about what they're doing.
Great, thank you, Chloe. We have quite a few questions coming in actually about the financial industry and the financial sector. So I'll open that up to all of you, because I know, Abby, that you've also done work in terms of how financial institutions are responding to modern slavery legislation as well. So there's somebody in the audience who's been trying to spread awareness with ESG and impact investors, many of whom are unaware about these issues. So what kind of success or lessons have you learned from working with investors specifically? And just generally, there's also a question around, can financial services play a stronger role in this as well?
Yeah, so financial services definitely can play a stronger role in this. They clearly have leverage to influence their investee companies and to actually be requiring them to be undertaking due diligence in order to be making their investments. So there's a clear leverage there. We have actually done an assessment of the financial sector within the Beyond Compliance series. So I will link to that report on the question there as well, where we did actually find, again, similar lack of engagement and lack of compliance, unfortunately. But there is absolutely potential there. And I think the tide is turning with some of these larger cross-sector initiatives. So investor initiatives actually bringing together examples of good practice, driving engagement with modern slavery risks and their role to drive those standards. So at Walk Free, our business team works closely with a number of investor networks on this issue, and I think it's definitely going in the right direction.
Great, thanks, Abby. And if any of the others want to add any comments there as well, feel free to do so. And I know, Chloe, you also touched a bit there on the kind of mandatory human rights due diligence laws, and as did Abby. And there's a question around how effective these laws are when it comes to addressing state-imposed forced labour. And I guess in the case of the EU, the due diligence law is upcoming, so I would also be interested to hear how effective do you think it could be based on the kind of legislation as it is currently?
Yes, that's an interesting question. So for context, anti-slavery, we've worked on the EU law since 2017, and we're also calling for a Business, Human Rights and Environment Act in the UK, which should introduce a corporate duty to prevent human rights abuses and environmental harm. And we also support the due diligence movements in numerous other countries. On state-imposed forced labour, it really depends on how they are designed. So Abby, I think, mentioned in her presentation about how companies were, if they were reporting anything, it was only on tier 1. And if we have due diligence laws that do not compel companies to identify the salient risks and the risks throughout their entire supply chains, regardless of where that harm is taking place, then they're realistically not going to be effective on state-imposed forced labour. So with Uyghur region, we are often looking at the so-called lowest tiers in the supply chain, but I'd also give the example of state-imposed forced labour in Turkmenistan, which is another area that anti-slavery works on in terms of cotton in Turkmenistan, which is at the lowest level of the supply chain again. And we need to see due diligence laws designed in that way that push that all that way. We also need to see them be appropriately designed around what disengagement looks like. So understanding where you need responsible disengagement and also where urgent disengagement in line with where state-imposed forced labour is needed. I'd also flag with the EU proposal currently, it's at risk that the entire financial sector could be excluded, which, given what we've just discussed, the enormous role the financial sector plays in terms of both being linked to harm, but as a leverage to improve practice, it will be enormously a missed opportunity and harmful if they're excluded. And the current proposal, the initial proposal from the Commission was also just going to, if they did include the financial sector, only require so-called pre-contractual or pre-investment due diligence. If we're talking about Uyghur forced labour, if have they been invested into that and hadn't realised it was there, because Louisa laid out the timeline, they need to divest now. It can't just be pre-investment when they're making that decision. It needs to be an ongoing process. So there's a lot to play for, and we see that debate ongoing on the EU, and there's many, many people, including businesses and business associations, calling for improvements to where some of that debate is going. I also do want to highlight, though, the importance of import controls. So the EU is also developing its forced labour proposal, which would address state-imposed forced labour as well, if it's effectively designed. And we see the power and the complementarity of having both due diligence laws and import controls.
Great, thank you, Chloe. And I think a real call out there also to the participants, for those that are working on these types of laws or are feeding into them, to really take note of that kind of importance of the financial sector there as well, and making sure that they are not excluded from these laws. I see a few requests, Abby, around sharing the report. So if that can be shared in the chat or perhaps in an email at the end of the panel as well. Sorry, Louisa.
Put both of those in the chat just to let people know, but I will also email them out.
Well, let me give a response to some of Trevor Thompson's questions and others. You know, it's interesting, even looking at some of the renewables industry associations, they are calling for clean energy has to be good for people as well, right? It can't be built on the backs of forced labor. And of course, we would add dirty coal, as Chloe mentioned. But if you can read, and I'll put the link in, this Solar Energy Industries Association in the US said, we are strongly encouraging companies to immediately move their supply chains out of the region. Now, you know, it's something that's good that they say it. You'd think everyone would say that, and then how much, but in fact, many industries, they won't even say that because they are afraid of offending or damaging their relations with regulators inside China. So in fact, just even having a statement like this is a step forward, but then those industries that have done so, particularly in the solar area, if that can be shared with ESG managers at these upcoming conferences. That's not NGOs saying it, that's the industry saying it.
Thank you, Louisa. And I think really also banging on that importance of transparency and getting that data out there as well, which I think is really key here. And maybe actually a follow-up question to you, Louisa. We've seen kind of there was this real push and a lot of media attention around those kind of examples of forced labor in the Uyghur region. But we've also seen a kind of decrease of media attention. So I would just be interested in kind of your take on exactly what is the current situation in the Uyghur region, and what actions do companies and governments need to continue making and need to continue engaging on this so that we don't lose that pressure as well.
Well, this is why I emphasize the fact that the leader of the Communist Party personally went to Urumqi on August 26th to again endorse the policies and talk about the need to strengthen stability, to further ensure that the ethnic groups, that there's ethnic harmony, which is a code word for continued suppression of Uyghur identity, religion, family life, and so on, and the language, actually. Yes, it's hard to get press coverage when you have a government that is ever more determined to hide what's happening, not only to keep out of foreign journalists, to obviously continued total censorship, to threaten relatives who are concerned, if I speak up, my own relatives will suffer more. You know, a Chinese police officer has my number here in Australia or here in Brussels. They're following me even though I don't live in China and telling me to watch out or my family may suffer. And in fact, I personally fear for my own, you know, interference in my own life. In other words, there's a very big campaign. So I do hope people understand that if you don't have street level coverage like you might have of some horrific conflicts around the world, you can't film it because everyone who has the information is intimidated and prevented. And in fact, the government has a lot of money put into positive propaganda, promoting tourism, financing YouTubers who come around and say, you know, everything's fine here, people are happy. So I would say I don't have a solution to the dilemma, but there is a great deal of misinformation. So at least, you know, people attending here know that, and we'd get more suggestions. We just put out a report condemning 7 international travel companies for continuing to offer tours to the region as if you could have a luxury tour in a place of genocide. So a bit by bit, we are just hoping to point out that silence is complicity.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think just shows the kind of importance of the role of organizations like yours to really keep highlighting these issues, and especially when there is so much kind of suppression and repression of those that want to speak out as well. Maybe just also, I'm just checking if there are any other Q&A. We have a comment saying, thanks for your courage and work, Louisa. Thanks to you for all the work that you do. I will just see if there are any other questions coming up. Maybe we can move on to see what is coming up next for the organizations here. So I know that you are all doing a lot of work and you've touched on some of that already, but around what is coming up in terms of climate change and what you're doing around modern slavery in your organizations. And feel free to share if you have reports coming out or anything that you want to highlight at this point as well. Maybe I'll just go to Abby first of all.
Sure, thank you, Aileen. So in terms of this Beyond Compliance project, I've just shared a link in the chat to our data dashboard, and that's a part of the project that we're continuously updating, and it houses all of the most up-to-date data across the different sectors that we've researched. So I'd really encourage anyone who's been interested in these findings to look at that. The renewable energy sector is also on there, but also the hospitality sector, garment sector, and finance sectors. And you can explore the data interactively, looking at the different trends and looking at the differences between the types of legislation. In terms of what's coming next, we're hoping to look at the electronics sector as the next focus report. So we're just doing some scoping at the moment of that, and also to expand the project to look at different types of legislation. So we're mapping metrics for mandatory human rights due diligence legislation so that we can do a bit of a comparative study around the benefits and the improved reporting standards that we would expect to see under that legislation. And we're also doing a pilot project looking at reporting under stock exchanges, so sustainability reports, looking at the Thai Stock Exchange, and we're hoping to share some of the findings of that pilot soon.
Great, thank you, Abby. And I'll move over to Louisa with the same question there. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, can you repeat?
Just asking about what is coming up for your organization in terms of linking the renewable energy sector to those kind of issues around Uyghur forced labor.
We've just been talking with colleagues in the anti-slavery, anti-modern slavery movement on Uyghur local community in Australia, where we have, of course, the same issue. And it was interesting to learn that renewable, as much as cotton, is on the radar. So we'll be continuing to really make the point that clean energy has to be truly clean.
Great, thank you, Louisa. And over to you, Chloe, probably for the last comments of the panel, if there's anything that you want to highlight that your organization is working on.
Yeah, so two things. I'm not going to commit to dates because that will then work against me sometime in the future. So within the next by the end of the year, early next year, we'll be publishing, as I said, this guidance to investors and a policy brief, and that's together with the Investor Alliance for Human Rights and Sheffield Hallam University. Separately, in our other area of climate change work, which I mentioned earlier, we are launching soon, so watch this space on an official date, with some other partners, a global map collating the global evidence on the interlinkages between climate change, migration, forced labor, and human trafficking, to really also emphasize the scale of that problem and hopefully encourage locally led interventions and policy responses. And if anyone in attendance here would like to know more about that side of our work as well, you can feel free to get in contact with me.
Great, thank you so much, Chloe. I see some more comments as well from participants, just thanking you all for the exemplary work that you're doing and making such an informative session. And I think just to end the session here, I really want to kind of emphasize, based on what you are all saying, just of that importance that we do bring the social into the environmental when we're talking about climate change, and to continue and keep highlighting those issues such as Uyghur forced labor, as well as modern slavery more generally, and ensuring that it remains on the agenda at those climate events. And I think particularly striking, Chloe, that you're talking about events around minerals where Uyghur forced labor is not even being mentioned as well. So to close there, I want to encourage everyone to keep engaging and do read those reports and different outputs that the organizations are coming out with. So I will end the panel there, and thank you to everyone, and particularly to the panelists for their work on this.
Thank you.
Thank you.